Josh Brolin didn't come to make headlines. He came to talk about a film. The invitation had been extended weeks in advance. A quiet appearance, just 15 minutes on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, booked to promote a project that was personal to him. It wasn't a superhero blockbuster or a franchise sequel. It was something smaller, quieter, and rooted in real life. The kind of story that didn't always get the spotlight. The night of the taping, Josh arrived alone. No entourage, wearing a gray wool jacket, and carrying the look of a man who had spent more time listening than speaking. The studio buzzed as always, the crowd filtering in, the lights warming up, the applause signs flickering with mechanical enthusiasm. Backstage, producers reviewed notes. Everything seemed routine, but what no one could prepare for was how quickly routine would unravel. Colbert opened the show with his usual blend of wit and political jabs, moving through segments with practiced ease. When the time came to introduce Josh, the energy shifted. There was genuine excitement in the crowd. Josh had a kind of quiet gravity, the rare presence that made audiences lean forward without realizing why. He walked out to a warm welcome and shook Colbert's hand. The host smiled, but there was something behind it. A calculation that Josh, to his credit, seemed to notice. They began with small talk. Childhood, legacy, growing up with James Brolin as a father. Josh answered with honesty, deflecting praise but never retreating from it. Then came the film. He described it not as entertainment, but as an offering, a story about grief, memory, and rebuilding. Colbert nodded along, but halfway through Josh's explanation of the film's central theme, a father navigating guilt and reconciliation, Colbert interrupted. "Let's talk about a different kind of guilt," Colbert said, leaning forward. "You've played some controversial characters. Some would say dangerous ones. Do you think actors have a responsibility not to glorify morally gray people?" Josh paused. It wasn't the question itself that bothered him. It was the tone, calm, rehearsed, and clearly meant to press a nerve. "Well," Josh began carefully, "I think storytelling means exploring all sides of a person, especially the parts that make us uncomfortable. If we avoid complexity, we're not making art. We're just creating marketing." Colbert smirked slightly. "But isn't that a convenient way to justify roles that might send the wrong message? I mean, No Country for Old Men, W'd. Those characters weren't exactly aspirational." The crowd shifted. Some laughed. Others stayed silent. Josh didn't flinch. "I never claimed they were aspirational," Josh replied evenly. "I claimed they were human. If we stop telling stories about people who make mistakes, what are we left with? Cartoons." The tension sharpened. Colbert nodded slowly, then added, "So, would you say you don't believe in accountability in storytelling?" Josh blinked. "I believe in honesty," he said, "which sometimes looks like accountability and sometimes looks like discomfort. That's the risk of telling the truth. You don't get to control how it's received." Now, the studio was quiet. Not hostile, just still. Colbert glanced toward his producers, then back at Josh. "And do you think," he asked, "that portraying these kinds of characters, violent, complex men, contributes to real-world harm?" Josh leaned forward now, hands clasped together. "I think what contributes to real-world harm," he said, "is pretending that difficult conversations only belong to the people who already agree with us. I think what causes harm is when we stop trusting audiences to think for themselves. And I think reducing people, whether fictional or real, to symbols of what we're afraid of is the opposite of understanding." A single clap echoed from somewhere in the audience, then stopped. Colbert raised an eyebrow. "Well, that's certainly one way to look at it." And just like that, the mask slipped. Josh sat back in his chair, not angry, not defensive, just steady. "What's the other way?" he asked. Colbert hesitated. He looked down at his cards, flipped one over, then set them aside. "The other way," he said slowly, "is to ask whether people in positions of cultural influence are willing to admit that some stories don't need to be told anymore." Josh nodded once. "Or maybe," he said, "some stories just need to be told by people who aren't trying to win applause." There was a silence between them. Not the silence of dead air. Not even the silence of tension. It was the silence that follows when someone answers a question not as a guest, but as a person, without performance, without defense, without needing to be liked. Colbert adjusted his posture. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "So Josh," he said, tapping his cards without looking at them, Would you say the backlash to your roles has ever made you rethink the kinds of characters you're willing to play? Josh didn't hesitate. No, he said, because backlash isn't always the same as insight. Sometimes backlash just means someone was uncomfortable, and that's not always a bad thing. Colbert tilted his head slightly. So, you're saying your audience's concerns aren't valid? Josh shook his head. I'm saying discomfort isn't always an injury. Sometimes it's the beginning of recognition. And actors, like writers, like hosts, have to be brave enough to step into that space. A low murmur ran through the crowd. Not disagreement, just energy. The kind that filled a room when something unexpected began to take shape. Colbert narrowed his eyes. Is that how you feel about your past interviews, too? Because I noticed you've avoided some shows recently. People have been wondering why. Josh sat still for a moment, then answered. I've avoided shows, he said, where the goal isn't conversation, but gotcha moments. Where the host asks questions they already believe they have the answer to. Colbert blinked. I see, he said. The moment hovered, thin but sharp. Well, this is live, Colbert said flatly. So if you're accusing me of trying to corner you, I'd appreciate if you said it plainly. Josh didn't look away. I'm saying, he replied, that we all have platforms, and what we choose to do with them says more about us than the person in the guest chair. A few claps rose in the audience, quickly silenced by the awkward stillness on stage. Colbert leaned back, voice tightening. I think we've covered enough ground, he said. But the audience wasn't with him anymore. They weren't angry, just watching carefully. Then let's talk about the film, Josh offered. But Colbert waved it off. I think we're out of time, he said. We'll be right back after this. The band played. The lights dimmed, but Josh didn't move. During the break, Colbert stood and walked off stage without looking back. Producers rushed over, some motioning toward Josh's seat, some whispering into headsets. One approached Josh directly, asking if he could wait backstage for the team to regroup. Josh stood slowly. He looked toward the crowd, many of whom had caught on that something real had just happened. He nodded once to the audience, then turned to the nearest camera, the one still rolling wide for the live stream, and said just one line. I came here to talk about something meaningful. I hope you'll still take the time to find it. Then he walked off stage, quietly, without anger, without applause. By morning, the footage had already gone viral. Not the sanitized broadcast version that had been trimmed, edited, and repackaged to fit inside the familiar rhythm of network late night, but the live stream, still accessible through third-party feeds, which showed everything. The interruption, the tension, the moment Josh refused to play along, and then the walk-off without outburst, without spectacle, just clarity. The reaction was immediate. Some called it arrogance. Others called it integrity. But what no one called it was fake. Because in a world saturated with staged conflict and curated authenticity, this moment felt unmistakably real. Clips spread across platforms, each with its own caption. Brolin stands his ground. Josh Brolin calls out performative hosting. Is this the beginning of the end for late night? But it wasn't just the headlines that told the story. It was the comments beneath them. Viewers who had never paid much attention to Josh's interviews suddenly watched them in full. They saw not a man seeking attention, but one challenging the idea that every guest must play a role scripted by someone else. They saw discomfort handled with calm, disagreement handled with grace, and a refusal to shrink in order to fit someone else's frame. One comment read, "You can disagree with him, but you can't deny he showed up ready to talk, not perform." Another, "It's rare to see someone walk away when staying might have gotten louder applause." Even Colbert's longtime fans had questions. The message boards, normally filled with punchlines and praise, now debated tone, intent, and whether confrontation had replaced curiosity on shows once designed for conversation. Inside the network, things were quieter. Producers scrambled to clarify the optics. Statements were drafted. A post was released that called the moment a creative misunderstanding and praised Josh for his thoughtful presence, even as it skirted responsibility for the tension viewers had clearly witnessed. Josh made no public statements. He returned to work, finished promoting the film on smaller platforms, and spoke to student journalists and podcast hosts who asked deeper questions. He answered them with the same steady voice he'd used on stage. A voice not chasing headlines, just meaning. 3 weeks later, an audience member from the original taping wrote an open letter. It was published quietly on a local blog. She wrote, "I was there. I came expecting laughs and applause signs. I left thinking about how we treat people who don't smile on cue. The letter gained traction. Other guests who had been on similar shows began speaking out. Not about Colbert directly, but about the broader culture. The unspoken rule that if you want airtime, you have to give up the right to challenge the frame around you. And yet Josh had done exactly that. Not by shouting, not by flipping the desk, just by refusing to shrink. In time, the story faded from headlines, as they always do, but something lingered. The footage didn't disappear. The quote didn't disappear. I came here to talk about something meaningful. I hope you'll still take the time to find it. And for those who watched, who listened, who felt something shift, that line stayed with them because it wasn't just about one man on one stage with one host. It was about what happens when someone finally just tells the truth. If you believe real conversation requires real risk and that dignity does not depend on applause, share this story and let us know. When someone tries to control the frame, do you step back or step forward? Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.